Here is my Unit 2 vlog. The spirit of the American Revolution made sure that indentured servitude and the union of church and state would come to an end in the new country. But it would take a lot more time for slavery to be abolished and for women to finally get the rights they deserved. The country had first started off with a unicameral Congress under the Articles of Confederation that couldn't regulate commerce or enforce taxes to pay off the country's debt. It also had very little power to keep control, and all these issues were brought up by Shays' Rebellion. It was made up of farmers who had debts they couldn't pay off due to not being paid themselves, and they decided to rise up because of it. This scared the financially prosperous founding fathers to change the articles so that the government could better help the people. Instead of changing them, though, the articles were to be replaced by the Constitution, which supported a strong central government. This sparked much debate, but finally supporters of the Constitution, or Federalists, beat their opponents and the Constitution was accepted on June 21, 1788. After the Constitution was put into effect, the Electoral College unanimously voted George Washington to be President of the United States in 1789. The new Congress set up the Supreme Court with John Jay as Chief Justice. Washington chose Thomas Jefferson to be the Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton to be Secretary of Treasury. Hamilton immediately started working and tried making the policies of the government to better suit the rich. In his mind, this would get the rich to lend their support to the government, which would make the rich richer, the government thrive, and the wealth would trickle down to the masses. He also wanted a national bank, but his opponent, Thomas Jefferson, argued that it was unconstitutional. Hamilton also got the excise tax passed, resulting in the Whiskey Rebellion, which was put down by force. This showed the power of the new government, but many didn't like it, just like they didn't like Washington's proclamation of neutrality in 1793 because of the French Revolution. He stepped down as president in 1797, starting to the tradition that each president would only take 2 terms, and John Adams became the new president. The XYZ affair and Alien and Sedition Acts came to define the presidency of John Adams. Thomas Jefferson was elected in 1800. It became known as a revolution because power went from the Federalists to the Jeffersonian Republicans, but not much changed, and it wasn't violent. Part of the reason was at the end of his presidency, John Adams appointed many Federalists to open government positions. These Federalists are now known as the Midnight Judges. In 1803, the U.S. was offered the Louisiana Territory by Napoleon Bonaparte in exchange for $15 million. Jefferson thought buying the land was unconstitutional, but did so anyways because it was a good deal. The Embargo Act was passed in 1807, which prohibited exporting goods in an effort to hurt Britain and France, but it only hurt the U.S. economy, so it was replaced by the Non-Intercourse Act, which only prohibited trade with Britain and France. James Madison became the new president in 1809 and became the first wartime president. The War of 1812 had been provoked by the impressment of U.S. merchants by the British, but Britain had solved this problem before the war began. It did begin, though, due to the slow communication of the time. The war was bad for the U.S. since the soldiers weren't trained properly, the generals weren't that great, and there was a plan to invade Canada that was also horrible. Oliver Hazard Perry and others built a fleet of ships to capture a British fleet, and it was one of the few achievements of the war. In 1812, the British burnt down the capital of the United States. One of the battles of the war, the Battle of Fort McHenry, inspired the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner by Francis Scott Key. The last major battle was the Battle of New Orleans, which boasted the spirits of Americans and made Andrew Jackson a popular figure amongst the people. Strange thing about the battle was that it occurred after the Treaty of Ghent had been signed, so the war had already been officially over
by the time this battle occurred. After the war came the era of good feelings under President Monroe, though it was actually full of problems and there was an economic panic in 1819. In the election of 1824, in what is now called the corrupt bargain, no one got the majority of votes in the Electoral College. Despite Jackson having gotten the most, John Quincy Adams ended up being elected by the House of Representatives, because Henry Clay, who was the Speaker of the House, gave up his votes to Adams, and then later got a position as secretary. Jackson won the next election, though, and introduced the spoils system, and what was commonly called the Tariff of Abominations, and this led to the nullification crisis in South Carolina, which was later solved by Henry Clay with the Compromise Tariff of 1833. Under Jackson's presidency, there was also the Second Bank War, in which Nicholas Biddle called in all the bank's loans, causing a panic, and allowed Jackson to successfully veto the renewed charter for the bank. This led to the Panic of 1837, that defined the presidency of Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren. William Harrison became the next president in 1840. The United States was beginning to prosper and on its way to become a world power. In the 1840s, millions of Irish and Germans migrated to the U.S. The Irish stayed mostly in big cities while the wealthier Germans moved inland and bought land. Industry was flourishing in New England, but the cotton-dependent South continued to rely on slaves for profit. New England factory conditions were terrible and were sometimes worse than slavery due to the workers being paid slave wage and often weren't taken care of as well as the southern slaves were. Republican motherhood was popular, and women who worked in factories were always single and would quit their job to take care of the house after they got married. Railroads and steamboats revolutionized the transportation systems in the U.S. About 3/4 of Americans attended church, but most were deists. Deism inspired Unitarianism that preached the goodness of humans and salvation through good works. The new branches led to the Second Great Awakening that got more people involved than the first. It was by far strongest in the North. This led to small schools and greater sectionalism. Mormonism was also founded by Joseph Smith, who claimed to have been given the Book of Mormon on gold plates by an angel. The Mormons were harassed a lot, and Smith was killed, so Brigham Young took over and led them to Utah. At this time, Horace Mann fought for better schools, curriculum, and better pay for teachers, and women gained importance in forming campaigns against slavery, war, and alcohol.